Hey everybody, Go7, King of the Penguins here with a unit tier list for Fog. This is a response video to a True Bosses unit tier list for High Funds, where he had some Fog slander saying that we'd only have like 5 units to talk about because that's all we use. I'm gonna prove that wrong. I'm gonna rate all of these units on this tier list, which I will go using the Advanced Wars by Web tier system of 0 at the top for best and 4 at the bottom for worst. And away we go. These are in order by base, then airport, then harbor, and I believe I have them in the order of how much they cost. So first off is the infantry, which by far the most important unit, goes top of tier 0. In all modes, I imagine this is going to be the top unit. It does everything that you kind of need. Specific things in Fog of War that it does is be a very cheap scout unit. It only costs 1,000, it's the cheapest unit in the game, so you're going to build a lot of them. Of course, in all modes, it's going to capture your properties, give you income, take income away from your opponent. In Fog of War, you can use it to check forests to see if there's anything hidden in there, to go into forests to occupy that space and be a really annoying blocker that's going to take more hits to take out than a normal infantry would, just because they have to use an entire unit just to see it in the first place. It can step on the mountains to give you extra vision. It can go across the impassable terrain to give you vision and go for captures that vehicles can't harass and that kind of thing. So it can go over like mountains, it can go over rivers. In Fog of War, you're going to use it a lot to start engagements, start the escalation of the fight, where it's going to be like either you're going to start capturing a property and then they have to commit 2 units to stop your infantry, and then you can commit 3 or 4 units to kill their 2 units, and then they commit more and you commit more, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And to do that, you need to use infantry to start the escalation, because if you commit too much at once, then you'll lose too much with their counterattack. So the infantry are going to be the ones that start all the fights in Fog of War that are those escalation fights rather than like an ambush. So that's going to be very important. They have very I wouldn't say very minimal, but not great vision. They only see 2 squares unless they're on the mountain, in which case they see 5, but it's enough that they can still be used for scouting and providing vision in fights. And that's going to be their main uses. It's just getting money, being blockers, checking forests, being scouts, and starting the fights and exerting pressure in the game. So that's why they're so valuable. They're also very cheap. So they have that nice niche of being an incredibly valuable unit while also being incredibly expendable, which is very unique, and the one unit you will probably build throughout the entire game. And its presence is most felt when you don't have any left. That's when you're going to start scrambling. Okay, so next we've got the mech, which the mech is pretty good in Fog of War. I think I'll put tier 2 here. The mech is pretty good in Fog of War. It has a big boon in a few ways. The fact that transports are better in Fog of War helps the mech, and the fact that you have forests around the map that you can drop your mechs into, that your opponent won't know that there's mechs there, of course. So you can have like an infantry or a tank or something within 2 tiles of forest, and then they hit you with a tank, and then your mech comes out and gets a nice punish. So that helps mechs a lot in Fog of War. It's not so much a unit that you'll spam, but it's a unit that can be very good as a support tier composition. It's very cost effective. There's mountains that you'll want to control, there's forests that you can use, and there's going to be transports that are already built, ready to be utilized off of a transport opening. But the mech itself isn't quite a like meta defining unit or an opening defining unit. It'd be very rare that you go for a mech opening. It's more just going to be a support of another opening, which is not going to be the same. The same won't be true if there's a recon here. The recon is a meta-defining unit. It is a unit that will define an opening. There are recon openings, and pretty much if there's I'm gonna rate any unit that has is kind of meta defining or opening defining. I'm gonna rate those pretty highly because I value that a lot for Fog of War, the variety in openings. But the recon, of course, is very important in Fog because it has the highest amount of vision, or the class of the highest amount of vision, which is 5. So it's going to help a lot when it comes to the information game of Fog of War, knowing where your opponent units are, where they aren't, what properties they have control over, what units you might be able to harass. Should you attack into an army? Should you retreat from an army? The recon is nice and cheap. It moves very quickly, so it can give you some nice information. It also barely survives a tank strike, and as long as it's alive, it still provides just as much vision. So you're going to have a lot of recons that kind of like go in and maybe harass an infantry or something, and then they get hit by a tank and they survive at 1, and then they just retreat to a forest and get away and just provide vision. And then, of course, they're very cheap and quick, so they get used for recon openers, which are all focused around harassment of infantry, which recons do pretty well against. So that is very valuable as a unit. And of course, it supports other armies with information throughout the entire game. So it's another unit that you'll probably be building throughout, but not one that you spam out like infantry. But because it's so effective against infantry, you're going to see quite a few maps where if someone understands how the map plays out, they'll be more inclined to go for a recon opening, a very aggressive opening, and try and do some economic damage. Which means it's definitely a top of the class Fog unit. It's used both offensively as an attacker, offensively as an information gatherer, defensively as an information gatherer, and those are all very important for Fog, and very Fog specific in that regards, although its harassment potential is felt throughout all modes. And let's pick the APC here, which I would love to put at the top, but I think it's gotta go in tier 1. So it is a meta-defining unit. There's transport openings that heavily rely on the use of APCs and building your economy and getting boosts to get extra properties, or properties faster, I should say. But it isn't the kind of unit that you have to build. And technically the recon isn't either. There are some strategies that just don't build recons, but it's pretty rare. The APC is a unit that you can just not build ever and be totally fine. But it is still very, very good and has created its own meta, so I kind of have to put it here. It not only transports units, it also resupplies units, which is a big deal in Fog maps because they tend to be very large. So your planes and copters can often run out of fuel, especially if you're against Drake, of course. It's also a really good blocker. The APC does not die in one hit from any of the early game vehicles, or units in general. Like if you can survive a single hit from an infantry, a recon, an artillery, a tank, an anti-air, or a copter, then you're going to be a really good blocker. And that's something that the APC can do very well. So not only is it going to be used to transport infantry and accelerate your capture game, it can also be used as a blocker in the interim, which is nice. It can also occupy forests and hide in there. Actually, while we're talking about this one, I'm going to skip the line and we can bring up the transport copter, which I think comes behind the APC. And this is kind of an interesting comparison because you're going to usually build more transport copters than you will APCs, but and there's two reasons for that, I should say. One, transport copters fly, which means they have better movement. And then two, they are built at an airport instead of a base, which means you get to build more infantry for your capture game. And whenever you build an APC, you can't build from that base anymore. So the transport copter is kind of more of a free extra unit, which is why you're going to be building it a lot more than an APC. The downside and why it's behind the APC, however, is that while it has some openings to it. There are transport copter openings. They're very, very map specific because the airport needs to be close, very close to the base in order to make the transport copter timing kind of work out well in comparison to just building an APC. The other things that have it kind of go against it here in comparison to the APC is that there are 2 early game units that one-shot transport copters, that being anti-airs and battle copters. And nothing feels worse than investing in your opening of a transport copter, especially because that usually means you have to like really rush the airport and then have it die after a single infantry gets dropped off because they like rushed a battle copter and just one-shotted you. So that's really bad. It also means you can't use it very effectively as a blocker like you can in APC, because there's usually going to be an anti-air with an army. Battlecopter is very common as well, so it can just get one-shotted, and it can't be a safe, effective blocker like you'd want it to. It even dies against like 3 infantry, so the loss in durability is really painful, and the ability of flight that it has isn't nearly as impactful as you might think. Like, it lets you go over forests pretty well, it lets you fly over mountains, but going that faster path really just leaves it more vulnerable to battlecopters because it's going to be separate from the army. It's kind of rough, but in general, you're going to build a lot more transport copters than you do APCs, even though I feel like it's a worse unit and certainly a worse opening to focus on, just because it's from an airport rather than the base. That's the big thing that's going to have going for it and what you'll experience. Next we have the artillery, which I'm going to put in the top of the tier here. It is also a meta-defining unit. There's an openings that are artillery based. There's an entire play style that's just artillery based. It's very, very much a staple unit. It has fog specific tricks and tactics. You can of course go into a forest that's within 3 tiles of multiple cities, and then if you own those cities, you can just sit in the forest and you have vision of your own owned properties. So if they go to capture those cities, you can then shell them from the safety of your forest. And it's harder for them to dive and like kill the artillery because they have to have one unit that reveals it and then another unit that hits it. So you can use it to protect and lock down your own cities. You can also use it to lock down opponents' city or like neutral properties that your opponent would normally capture, and just have it locking that down as long as it has vision support and some other. So that you can utilize forests very well, but there's also the ability for it to just play the fog game really nicely. So there's lots of cases where you can have like an infantry or recon or a tank kind of somewhat exposed in the plains, and then even without any force around, you just have the artillery back behind it hidden in the fog, and then they come up and hit that unit, and then the artillery punishes it, even though the artillery is kind of sitting out in the open on the plains or road or something. It can just play the information and fog game to protect itself and be useful that way, which is very fog specific. You wouldn't usually want to do that, just kind of have your artillery out in the open in the other modes, because they'll dive in and get them. So it's definitely very strong. It's going to win. There's kind of these battles of escalation that your infantry start that can kind of result in a giant brawl with lots of tanks. The artillery will win those brawls because like 5 tanks and 1 artillery is a lot stronger than 6 tanks. So because the artillery of course gets to hit without being hit, it doesn't occupy one of the spaces that you need for direct units to hit each other. It's just going to win those fights for you very nicely. So it's not, unless you're really trying to, you can spam them out and have some success that way, but oftentimes it's going to be more of a unit that you're going to build like 3 of with your army, or 2 as an opening, and have a lot of success with that, keeping it alive and having other units kind of sacrifice themselves for it, and then it's just helping them in the fights. So while it is a unit that technically you can do without and do just fine, you will be better off having ever built in artillery, and it's more up here because it's got its own kind of meta and very, very good fog implementation. Anyway, that's why it's up here. I think it's definitely towards the end of this tier because you can get by without using an artillery, but it's definitely higher than these others. It's very, very good. And next we have the tank, which I will put ahead of the recon. Yeah. So tanks are very, very good. The tank opening and tanks in general are very versatile. They can be offensively used, they can be defensively used. They have a vision of 3, which is kind of fine. It's like good enough to get by. It's just enough that you could be in a forest and have vision over a property, be ready to interrupt if something happened there, or set up some sort of attack or ambush. They are really good against infantry. They're really good against recons. So they kind of can mess with transport openings. They can mess with recon openings. And that's 2 different types, right? Against the transport opening, your tank is being very, very aggressive. And against the recon opening, it's being very defensive. And that's where that versatility comes in. It's just a strong unit that can play all roles, even a little bit of scouting. Against artillery, it can struggle, but a lot of that will come down to the information game. If you have a really good read on what your opponent's doing and where they're going to be sending their units, you could even have your tanks just walk up and shoot an artillery that thought it was going to be safe. But if you were like watching their replays or something like that, and you're like, well, they always send an artillery over to this forest before the units show up, kind of try to like set up something. And then you're like, well, if they always do that, I'll just have a tank waiting and then smack. So definitely one of the top units in Fog of War. They're very fast and they're very versatile, and you can technically play games without them, but at least a few should be had. Next we have the anti-air, which isn't going to make it up here at the top, but I think it should be in between the APC and the transport copter. It's a unit that is pretty necessary for every game. You don't have to. Sometimes you'll just rely on just a ton of battlecopters to fight off opposing battlecopters, but the general rule of thumb is to have at least 1 anti-air per front so that you don't get surprised and taken out by air. But in comparison to the other modes, it does miss out on a lot of the harassment potential that it would normally have, because it has to be there to protect you against those kind of surprise attacks that can come from the fog. It can't be utilized to kind of go off on the fringes or onto the front lines to try and snipe off an infantry without enough protection. Otherwise, it gets picked off by some tanks, and then the copters run in. So it isn't a unit that is going to really define how you're playing your game, but is going to always be there as more of a support unit. There is on a few maps an anti-air opener, but it's very, very niche, and it's only an anti-air opener because of the prevalence of battlecopter openers on those maps. So it's not I wouldn't call it a real opener, it's more of a response. We got the missile, which I'm definitely putting in tier 4. The problem with it is that it's too slow and expensive. I'll probably put it at the top of tier 4. The nice thing about the missile is that in Fog of War it is a self-sufficient unit. It has a vision range of 5 and an attack range of 5. So you can kind of have a missile just in a forest and it just is fine. It just takes care of itself. If a copter comes into range, if a bomber comes into range, it can just fire. It doesn't need other units around trying to support it. The problem is that it's got 4 movement and it's on tires. And forests for tires costs 3 movement and planes cost 2. So if it's ever in a situation where it needs to cross a single plains tile to enter into a forest, it just can't do that. It has to move onto the plains tile next, like waiting to go into the forest, and that's so vulnerable and so slow that it's gonna have a hard time really getting value. And there's another downside to it, being its cost of 12,000. Its most likely target is going to be a battlecopter, and it's not super unlikely that you'll get that shot off, right? You could be hidden in the forest. It'll take you like 6 turns to get there, but you could be hidden in the forest and the battlecopter kind of stumbles into your range, and then you fire and kill it. But now your opponent knows that you have a missile there. It's not too difficult to deduce where the missile attack came from. The missile is too slow to really get away, so it can be located and taken out very effectively. And it didn't even pay for itself. It killed a battlecopter, which cost 9,000, and the missile cost 12,000. So when it's kind of getting the dream off and getting a kill, and it doesn't pay for itself, that's really bad. So I'm sorry, missile, but you're at the you're going to be at the top because you do have some fog use, but the top of tier 4, but you're still tier 4. Rocket will be tier 3. It's kind of a similar boat to the missile. It costs a little bit more, but it hits land units, which is nice. The big difference, though, is that it has 5 move instead of 4. And there's lots of situations where it's like roads up to a city, and then plains, and then forest. And in this case, the rocket has something very nice over the missile because it can, go along the roads into the city and might attack from the city. But then it can actually go into the plains and then the forest and kind of set itself up into a position in a much safer way. But it does have the same problem that the missile has in cost effectiveness. This costs 15,000, and oftentimes it's going to end up shooting a tank that costs 7,000. And when it does that attack, it's often going to be revealed as to what forest that rocket was in. And it's not going to be too difficult for like a tank heavy force or like tank and recon heavy force to root out your rocket and smack it with a tank. So it's definitely going to be down here in tier 3. It's better than a missile. It does have some use, and there are some maps where the rockets can be very effective. It's very easy to protect, but it's really not like artillery level. Like an artillery costs less than the tank and hits it very hard, and so you can kind of get away with using that artillery in those like fog setups I was talking about, where it's just standing out in the open, just protected by the fog. That's something you wouldn't want to do with a rocket because the risk is so much greater to lose a 15,000 cost unit in comparison to just a 6,000. Next we have the medium tank, which I'm going to put at the top of tier 3. The problem that the medium tank runs into is that it's slow. It's slow-ish. It has 5 tread movement, which is pretty bad for a few reasons. One, it can't like catch tanks and that kind of thing. It moves as fast as artillery. But the problem it's running into is that there's a lot of maps where they have a forest set up at a choke point from your base to slow down your vehicle deployment. And oftentimes it's like 4 plains tiles and then the forest, so that tanks are moving their full movement and ending inside that forest right there. And that really is bad for the medium tank because it moves those 4 tiles, and then it only has 1 movement point left, and it needs 2 to enter into the forest. So it just gets hosed out of another one of its movement points, and it's moving just 4 tiles instead of 5, and then it has to spend 2 on the next turn entering into the forest. So having that slower movement from the tank is not only bad for like front switching and just general combat on the battlefield, but it can also hurt it in those reinforcement paths, which is very painful because it is also a little bit spendy of a unit at 16,000. So you'd like that to hit the front lines as fast as possible. It also has some problems that it doesn't one-shot tanks. It does one-shot anti-air and artillery, so it has that going for it. It's definitely got uses, but because it doesn't one-shot tanks, it can run into some serious problems of hitting a tank. It doesn't even kill the tank just goes back and heals. Maybe there's artillery around that can shoot it. That'll make you really sad. Maybe there's some battle copters. That's going to be very common. A bunch of battle copters come out of the fog and dogpile onto the medium tank can take it out. Or even worse is if a Neo tank was built. If you build a medium tank, it takes a while to get there. They build a Neo tank, it moves faster and just completely decimates your medium tank. You're gonna be really, really sad. So it has a lot of counters, and the counters it has are very prevalent units in Fog of War, and it has really bad movement. So it's definitely tier 3, probably the top of tier 3 here. It has some uses. It's going to be decent. Like it can win tank fights if it has some nice support, and if you're using it with a movement CO, then it can be a lot more effective than if you weren't. So like Max can use it pretty well. Andy, Adder, Cole, Jess, all of those guys, they can all use the medium tank a lot better than other COs like Kindle can, or like Drake. I mean, they can still use them well, but the movement boost helps us a lot. Kind of similar to Mechs. We got the Pipe Runner. The Pipe Runner will definitely be in tier 4. The big problem that the Pipe Runner has is that pipes are always revealed in Fog of War, including all of the units on the pipes. So you can never have a surprise Pipe Runner. They can always see it. There's no maps where the pipes are running all the way across the map, so it's going to be very limited to just defending bases. There are quite a few fog maps that have pipes near bases, so you could, in theory, build the Pipe Runner, but it's not going to be able to go anywhere you'd like it to, and your opponent's going to immediately know that you have a Pipe Runner, which is both dangerous for the Pipe Runner itself, because it's kind of flimsy and made of paper, but it also means that they know that you just invested in the Pipe Runner, and are going to have weaker reinforcements to your fronts. So it's really bad. The Neo tank. That Neo tank I'm actually going to put in tier 0. The back of tier 0. It is a meta-defining unit. There is even Neo tank openers that can be very effective, because a few things that the Neo tank has over the medium tank is it moves at 6 movement, which is nice. It one-shots tanks, which is very, very good. And what makes it a valid and viable opening unit is it's very expensive, so it's going to like show up a little late, but it will show up and then start just destroying their army, because it shows up, one-shots a tank, and then it moves as fast as the tank. So it's even possible for it to one-shot a tank and then one-shot another tank on the following turn. And it's going to very quickly start paying for itself and winning those very early fights. It also can kind of take an artillery shot depending on the terrain and the firepower boosts that are going on. It kind of live to tell the tale and get some very effective repairs. It also beats medium tanks very nicely, and the extra movement means it can also be used as an ambush unit very effectively. It does only have one vision, so it does require some support. Otherwise, it can kind of get lost in the fog. But because it one-shots so many things, it one-shots artillery, recons, tanks, infantry, anti-airs, APCs, mechs. It doesn't one-shot medium tanks, but it almost does, like rockets, missiles. While moving at 6 movement, it's very, very, very good. And definitely the best heavy vehicle that you can get in Fog, and it's even strong enough that it can be an opening unit. Although it is definitely a riskier opening and a little bit more map specific, but you can pull it off and have some surprising success with it. And then in contrast to that, we have the Mega Tank, which I'm actually going to put behind the missile, which is really shows the power of movement here. The Mega Tank has 4 movement, so it's very slow. It's even slower than the medium tank, which... Oh, another thing about the movement differences for front switching in Fog of War, which is a very big component to match where your opponent's attacking or match where they're trying to attack where they're really weak. The extra movement's very good for that, which the Mega Tank lacks. It only has 4 movement, so it's very, very slow. And while being very slow and very expensive, even worse, it only has 3 ammo. So even though it one-shots like everything, it's often going to like come out, maybe it kills a medium tank, maybe it kills most likely like just a tank, and then it has 2 ammo left. And the thing about recons is they count as vehicles. And oftentimes you'll have some recons that are really low on health because they're like harassed a unit, a tank hit them, and they got away with 1 HP. A 1 HP recon can hit a mega tank and soak up a whole point of ammunition there. So if you go up with your mega tank and you kill a tank, and then 2 low health recons come out and just slam into your mega tank, you are now out of ammo, and the mega tank will just get killed by neo tanks or even medium tanks. It's an absolute nightmare situation for the mega tank in Fog of War. There are times where it's going to be good. It can be like a follow-up unit to like APC, so you have the APC around to try and resupply it. If you're like playing Andy, the mega tank's really hard to kill. It can generate you a lot of funds. So if you do like an Andy APC opener, then maybe you can get some nice use of the mega tank. But remember, it's also really slow, so it's going to require even more support units. Like maybe it's a water map, and you can build a lander for it to try and get it to the front lines. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge investment that just takes forever to get into the fight, and that's really why it's down here. And we're talking like I built a lander, I have to have an APC, I have to be Andy, and then my mega tank can fight. But even then, even in all of those situations, they can still do that same thing where they just slam in really hurt units to just drain all 3 of its ammo in a single turn and then take it out. So I would say it's worse than missiles. You'd probably see some more viable play, but only in very specific situations, and the missiles could also be used more. Yeah, no, I think it's behind the missiles. It doesn't have the self-sufficiency that the missile has. Okay, so battlecopters. I'm going to put battlecopters tier 0 behind the recon, ahead of the artillery. It's going to be one of your bread and butter units as part of the unit triangle of tank, anti-air, and battlecopter. It's a unit that you build from the airport, so much like with the transport copter, you're kind of gaining units from your bases when you build battlecopters. Well, usually you're just gaining infantry. You build battlecopter and there's infantry. Which is very nice, and oftentimes you kind of build battlecopters just for that unit count. There are battlecopter openings. It's a little more map specific, but they're still very strong, especially if you know your opponent's doing a tank opener, like an aggressive tank opener. Then the battlecopter opening is going to be very good against that. If you know your opponent's doing like a transport copter opener, your battlecopter opener can just crush it entirely and ruin their day. The battlecopters can't hide in forests, which is something to keep note. Same with the transport copters. So if you ever put these in forests, you're letting your opponent know that there's nothing in that forest. I mean, there's a battlecopter in it, but they don't get defense boosts from terrain. But if like the battlecopter was next to the forest, then they don't know if there's anything in there. So you should be careful with your placement of the battlecopters. In Fog of War, you usually don't want to have very aggressive battlecopters attacks unless you have really good intel, because anti-airs are very, very common to have like 1 or 2 with the army. So if you just slam into the army with a battlecopter to like hit a tank, you're probably going to get killed by an anti-air. Same with if you're trying to be like walling with your battlecopter, that's probably going to get killed by an anti-air. So probably not worth going for that. Instead, you can use it very defensively. So like they attack you with some tanks, and then you go battlecopter tank, battlecopter mech to kill a tank and take no damage or retaliation. Maybe there's a point you're trying to take out, and you want to attack from the side because battlecopters fly, and it's like there's water there or there's a mountain there, and the battlecopter can attack from there and let you take out the front, which is a very useful tool. And of course, it's going to be very good for just increasing your unit count. So you're going to see a lot of games, lots and lots of battlecopters get built, but it's also another one of these units that you can just do without for a really long time. I mean, I would recommend that you end up building at least 1 or like 2 in your game, but you don't have to. You can definitely just rely on having anti-air to kill their battlecopters. And as long as your anti-air doesn't die, it can be a huge increase in value for your units there. Or I guess a decrease in their value for the opponent. Some people really go very, very heavy in the battlecopters to not build anti-airs and just have battlecopters to fight battlecopters, which can kind of work. It's another use of using these kind of very defensively. And the other thing to keep in mind is battlecopters are very nice for your army because your opponent only has like 1 or 2 anti-air. So if they ever put those in a place that's kind of exposed, if they like attack one of your fronts with the anti-air, use your tanks, kill the anti-air, and then your copters can just have a killing spree going after all of their units. That's a big deal. You can also like have a very targeted strike where you use like a neo tank to break through the wall, then the tanks kill their anti-airs, and then your copters attack. That's also very good. And kind of a little bit fog specific because copters fly, they can be pretty flexible in where they're hiding in the fog, and so your opponent might not know how many battlecopters you have, and might not have enough anti-airs to deal with that, and you can kind of run them over with some of those targeted attacks where normally their army would do really well against you. So in Fog of War, it's a little bit more, I would say, kind of a support unit, unlike in like Standard where it can be almost on the level of the tank sometimes. Anyway, next we've got the fighter, which I'm going to put in tier 2. Definitely behind the mech. It's kind of interesting. So you would think that the fighter is something you build to deal with bombers. Or deal with stealths. But you can definitely use them to just take out copters. And have some nice use out of that. The nice thing is, of course, in Fog of War, I was saying that they have like 1, maybe 2 anti-airs with their armies usually. So that means that the fighter usually doesn't die, because like an anti-air hits it, but fighters survive an anti-air hit. So it can kind of be a durable air unit, which is fine when you're like taking out copters. Sure, you kill a copter, you get hit, and then you're still alive, you can harass copters. That's nice. But the really important thing about that is it can be used, and often does get used, for HQ caps, because it can be very difficult to wall against your opponent in Fog of War because you don't necessarily know what they have, where their units are, but the fighter just doesn't care. Nothing one-shots the fighter, so it can be used to wall off an HQ cap very effectively, and it's almost that's almost the real use of the fighter in Fog of War. Like, it kills bombers, sure it kills stealth, sure it kills fighters, sure it's just like an annoying blocker in general. But when it comes to the HQ caps, it's kind of the ace in the hole. Just plop, just right in the way, and then the HQ's yours. Especially on like the map Marengo that has like some mountains around the HQ too. Fighters are absolutely broken for HQ caps on that map. And we have the bomber. I'm going to put the bomber ahead of the fighter, basically because it can be used to fight the Neo Tank. And Neo Tanks are very, very strong in Fog. But bombers themselves can struggle sometimes because there is always an anti-air presence. And with even just a slight firepower boost, anti-airs will one-shot bombers. And if your opponent catches wind that you have a bomber, they'll just build another anti-air. And if they have 2 anti-airs together, your bomber's in a lot of trouble. It's going to have a hard time getting any value. Oftentimes it's just going to be able to take, like, maybe pick off a tank, and then, like, fingers crossed, an anti-air or a fighter doesn't come out and just kill it. But if it's being used, like, very defensively in reaction or maybe in prediction of a Neo Tank, then it can have some pretty good success. But don't expect your bombers to get very much value. They're often going to be like, I killed a unit and then I'm taken out because they're so easy to take out, be shot out of the air by these anti-airs that cost a lot less. A stealth. I'll put stealth in tier 3. It's not as bad as a missile, but they definitely struggle in Fog. Fog maps tend to be really big, which hurts the stealth fuel problem quite a bit. It can take like 3 turns to make it to the front line sometimes. which is pretty much, if the stealth was stealth the whole time, it's basically out of fuel. Luckily, there are APC openers that can help with that, but because those reinforcement lines can kind of be pretty far, if they catch wind of your stealth, they'll just target down your APCs, and then your stealth can get surrounded by just like infantry and recons and the like, and then you're in trouble. The stealth will have a hard time actually finding a valuable target like the Neo tank in a way that like a bomber couldn't. And since usually before a stealth comes out, a bomber comes out, maybe there's a lot of battlecopters, it's not even that unlikely that they'll have a fighter. It's also kind of easy to predict the stealth and just build a fighter. And then, because if you predict the stealth, which is going to usually come from being like, wow, they haven't had any reinforcements for like 2 turns, because they've had to save up and then build a stealth, and then the stealth is invisible as it approaches, and then you're like, well, I guess I'll just build this fighter, and then if the stealth shows up and gets shot down immediately, then you'll like lose the game on the spot. These suckers are expensive. It does have an upside in that it has 4 sight range, so it's almost like a very expensive invisible recon if it survives an encounter, but that's not a great price to pay for an invisible recon. And so being surprisingly predictable and having a hard time on the large maps and the open maps, so it can't even be necessarily very good as a blocker, is really bad for the stealth. The problem is that fog, I mean, at lower levels it's probably going to be really good because people aren't used to stealths and predicting their movement and how to deal with it. There can be like a panic going on. But because Fog of War is heavily focused on the information war and just the information gameplay in general, you're already trying to think about what composition they could have that's hidden from you. So the stealth being a hidden unit is kind of losing some value, and that you can already like predict it's going to be there in the fog. So it's not as strong as you might think, and you can lose games off of building a stealth. It's usually going to be built when you have a very large income advantage over your opponent, and you know they just can't afford to get a fighter. They can't afford to guess or to like predict with the fighter, and even when the stealth shows up, they just can't afford to build a fighter. And then you close out the game that way. The Black Bomb. What the Black Bomb? I'll put it behind the mech, I guess. In Global League games, you'll never see Black Bombs. In like casual games, you might see Black Bombs. They are very strong. They're expensive, but they move 9 and they explode and do 5 damage to a bunch of units, which is really good because one of the effective play styles or strategies in Fog of War up to like 1300 is kind of the main one, is the Death Ball, where you just have a bunch of units together moving towards objectives and claiming them in such a way that's really hard to contest without like another Death Ball or something. But in that case, the Black Bomb is like, yay, a whole bunch of units are clustered together, I'll just run over there and boom, and then they all get knocked down to 5 health and get one-shotted and the Death Ball's gone. So in that respect, it's going to be really hard to see because it has a move of 9, the same as a fighter. It can just hide in the fog, target Death Ball, fly over there, and boom. But it is also really expensive, and it can run into some problems with getting trapped. But it is really good in fog, and it's going to be kind of specific to that kind of scenario, and you're not going to see it ever in Global League because it's a banned unit. But I'd put it behind the mech. The mech's going to have more use in a more general sense. Plus, I mean, you won't see this. Okay, we have the Black Boat. I'm going to put the Black Boat behind the fighter. It's either going to be behind the fighter or ahead of the medium tank. It's not very often that you're going to build Black Boats, but in the maps where you can effectively build them, They are nice. The repairs are good. It's a strong blocker and it's very fast. Yeah, no, I'll put it there. The blocking on the maps that you can build black boats is very strong, because it's going to be the ones where the shoals are kind of going through the battlefield. And there's quite a few fog maps that do that. It's not going to be a unit. No, I'm going to put it behind the medium tank. You'd build a medium tank before you build a black boat. But it's still a pretty solid unit, considering it's just like a transport unit. But the ability to transport infantry isn't nearly as good in Fog of War as it is in Standard. Where in Fog of War, you might be like unloading your infantry to just die against some vehicles or whatever, and not know because of the fog. But in Standard, you'd know where you're unloading, and you can just like go for some free properties and that kind of thing. I will put the lander ahead of the black boat though, because the lander does get used to accelerate the reinforcement routes in a kind of a really big way on a few maps that increase the viability of a lot of units, like the mega tank, the missile, the rocket, the medium tank. These all get a lot better when a lander can be utilized to pick them up straight from the base and kind of drop them like a turn away from the front lines. But it's still very niche. It's more impactful than the black boat because it can transport these other units that are much more effective than infantry. But there's only a few maps where that's going to be very effective, and even then you can do without it. So I would say it's more impactful than a stealth, a rocket, black boat. Usually it's transporting medium tanks, but I'd say the medium tanks are probably better because they can be built on their own. If we're looking at, oh my gosh, the cruiser. I mean, the cruiser is better than the pipe runner, but not by much. It's very few maps you're ever going to build a cruiser. The one thing that they've got going for them here is that they can hide in reefs and kind of pop out and hit battle copters. Very rare are you ever going to get a bomber. It's usually battle copters trying to hide over lakes or like swing around to hit an army from the side, and that's when the cruiser is going to be used. I wouldn't recommend getting it though. You usually just rely on your own battle copters to fight them, because while you can hide in the reefs and have those nice ambushes, the problem is if they're going really heavy with the battlecopter swing arounds, even if you ambush, if they have like 3 battlecopters, you lose that fight. It costs 18,000. It comes out, it kills a copter, which costs 9,000, and then the other 2 copters take out your cruiser. It's really, really expensive and very niche, but the ability to hide in reefs and pop out is pretty nice. Subs, on the other hand, I'll put them here. They do have some uses because they have 5 vision range, which is the same as a recon, while also being able to turn invisible. On the maps, there's like one map I can think of where you're given a submarine in your opponent's area, and in that case, you can kind of see it being very effective. The free vision that's really hard to deny can help a lot, because now you're not having to invest units of your attacking force into just getting vision, and a lot of the defensive advantage that you have in Fog of War kind of gets messed with there. Next we have the battleship. Oh, very rarely are you going to be building submarines to hit battleships in fog maps, at least for Global League, because they don't want to deal with the naval combat in Fog of War because of the problem with battleships and carriers and reefs. If there's ever a situation where there's a reef for the battleship to go into that's overlooking any meaningful part of the map, and there's no like easy access of airport, or if there's like only one harbor on the lake, there's nothing they can do. The battleship is just completely uncontested. So it would be a lot higher, but the fog maps are built so that the battleship isn't good. And the same is for the carrier, which I'll put behind the battleship. Actually, I'm going to put that behind the missile. I think missiles are more effective than carriers. But battleships are definitely more effective than missiles. And there's definitely some times where you'll build a battleship. A carrier kind of have the same dream situation where it finds a nice reef that it's now invisible, so no like land indirects can hit it, and it just completely locks down an airport, for instance. But it's going to be very, very rare. And okay, we have Uzium, which is not a unit that's in Advanced Wars by Web, but I'm going to put it. Well, I'll put it behind the Mega Tank. And from my understanding, it moves a single tile and it just one-shots everything it runs into. So it sounds like it's just a really bad Mega Tank. But I'll say a really bad Mega Tank is still better than a cruiser. In theory, I guess it could hide in the forest and then pop out and catch someone by surprise if they walked by it or got trapped against it. But it's not a unit in Advanced Wars by Web, so no need to worry about it. I'm going to quickly look at this tier list and see if there's anything I want to move around. So far, it looks pretty good. Maybe I could definitely hear some arguments for moving the Neo Tank down, but I think it is really the top unit for like the tech ups, and not. Even though it is like the top tech unit, it can still has its own opening that will find wins. So I'm fine with having it in tier 0. I think all of the tier 0s here are good. Arguably, you could move the mech up, but I don't think so. I think this is good. This is good. There'll be some people that probably want the rocket or the medium tank moved up, but I really see those units struggle a lot, even with the COs that can use them effectively. They can have some troubles just because like battlecopter, artillery, and neo tank, it's doomsday for the poor medium tank. And then you've got tank, recon, battlecopter, doomsday for the rocket. So yeah, I mean, some of this is going to be very fog meta as to why these things work as they do, like the current fog meta and the Global League maps. You could definitely have different fog maps where this would be completely different. But I think this is it, and I hope that was useful. And I'm going to quickly count here. How many? I'm going to say like up to tier 2 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm not counting that. 11, 12, 13, I guess, with the medium tank. 14. I'll take the lander too. I'll say like 14 units. That's pretty good. That's a lot better than 5. But yeah, I would say this is. I'd be interested to see what people think, but I think this is a pretty good tier list for Fog of War units, or units in Fog of War. And I'm gonna end the tier list there. I'm gonna leave you all with an apple like it was a stream. I hope you have a good one.